Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What brought you into the JCCS system? What challenges and successes have brought you to this current context?
My name is Matt Simon, and so I think I got into teaching originally to work with um, young people who just weren't achieving a lot of success in a traditional school system, and to work with young people who didn't have a social safety net. I grew up in privilege, and what I always thought is that my education was terrible, but my parents had enough money um, to put me in after school programs and to put me in summer programs that made up for the lack of education I received from my school, from my public school. And I did always wonder, well, what happens if I didn't have that privilege? What happens to students who have a lousy public school experience and they can't, actually engage in real learning outside of the school? So I think that's what brought me into education, wanting to work with students who didn't have that privilege, and the traditional school system wasn't working for them. I had that opportunity up in LA. I worked in a community called Pacoima in a charter school that made a lot of promises to kids. Like, one of the promises that by being here, you will achieve far more than you would at your public school. It's a no excuses model school. People call them KIPP model schools. And I loved the student population. I loved the community, but the idea, it never felt right to me that school itself would be why you were successful. I always thought that the message should be that you will be successful no matter what. This is something that will help you get there. And that the goal isn't to show how bad your public school is. The goal is just to provide an awesome model of education that other people may want to replicate. The other thing is that those schools were really focused on test scores. I felt like they were more focused on test scores than they were on students. And that consequently there was a ceiling on how far students could go with anything. And there was an oppression in the school, whether it was uniforms or making kids walk in straight and silent lines, and the idea that the teacher held this knowledge, and that if you just sort of complied with the program, you would get what you needed to get a good test score, and then that would then be used for fundraising, and there was no humanity to it. So I sought out a different teaching experience. I sought out a school called High Tech High, which was a liberating experience because you could truly design any powerful learning experience for students, often with students. And I found that it helped to have the sort of teaching chops I developed in LA to help move kids, look at data and figure out what kids need and to move them in one direction or the other. Those kind of like teaching chops helped, but to put that in a place of freedom to do or work on anything with young people and try to help them gain real knowledge and real skills that will be real valuable, as opposed to just learn information in a way that you can output it into a test, was really freeing for me. And I took advantage of that freedom. So one of the projects that my students worked on was to do a documentary about violence, exploring the issue of violence and what are the root causes of violence and what is actually happening in the country to reduce violence and how might we scale up some of those programs. And so we had a relatively privileged group of kids. I think High Tech High does have a relatively privileged group of kids, although there is diversity. There, on some level, you were privileged just to make it into High Tech High. And that's how they were looking at the world. So I wasn't working with students who constantly experienced violence, but students who had experienced violence, usually through media. But we also had a student at our school who was shot and killed by his own father. And so violence had touched our campus, but that's different than like violence is an everyday reality for our students. Nonetheless, we explored the issue of violence. So we asked kids if they'd be interested in doing it. They were. What kind of projects would you be interested in doing? And we had all these different ideas, and the students thought that clearly like making a documentary would be something they wanted to do. They had wanted to make films. They weren't able to. A film would outlast them. And that gave us opportunities to go travel to places like Southside Chicago to see what they were doing to reduce violence, Newtown, Connecticut, and what they had learned about violence, and Los Angeles and different places. Students decided they wanted to focus ultimately on 4 avenues for reducing violence. One was to improve the education that young people receive in the juvenile justice system. Sort of random, but it was born out of students doing a lot of research about what was happening with recidivism and looking at, we did have a young person in our class who had spent time in the halls and talked about how it just wasn't rehabilitative. It sets you up for a life of just returning to that system. And the more research that my students did, the more they found that while youth prisons were supposed to be rehabilitative, they weren't largely rehabilitative. They were punitive, and it was creating a cycle that you wouldn't want in an ideal society. They also looked at things like mental illness and mentoring and after-school programs and summer jobs programs, and all of those were powerful and spoke to me. I left this project anyway. The students made this film. It's called Beyond the Crossfire. There are copies available. And while traveling with students to Southside Chicago, with students to lockup facilities in LA, in San Diego, just little moments stand out for me. So little things like being in a lockup facility and meeting a 10-year-old. Going into a dozen lockup facilities and finding it almost impossible to find a white person, a white youth who's locked up. For me, those are, and then seeing what education looks like in Southside Chicago and Westside Chicago, and what those kids deal with, and the disconnect between their reality and what's happening in their schools. And I couldn't help but leave those experiences thinking, I'm so grateful for the time that I've spent at High Tech High, for the young people I've met, for the doors that those young people have opened for me. And I have to go work in an area, like with kids in the system, or with kids in a community where, which is the reason why I got into education in the first place. Go work with young people who need more from their education than privileged people do. So the juvenile court and community schools down here in San Diego asked me to help them with bringing some of the project-based learning that they saw in LA happening, bring something like that here. Support their teachers who we brought up there to go visit, support their teachers with not just what it is, but how to do it. So I started working with some of the teachers here and really enjoyed working with them, and decided to make the leap over here, specifically to help a pilot team of educators do project-based learning within the court schools, juvenile court and community schools here. And we have an instructional focus here that basically just says that students will demonstrate deep understanding, which is just a phrase, but as they built out what that looks like, for me, what I told them was my interpretation of it is that this to me sounds like discussion-based learning. This to me sounds like you're not just taking in information, you're wrestling with information and you're sharing, you're thinking about it in writing and speech. And the only way to do that well is to have lots and lots of
Can
discussion.
you tell us a little bit about the TIP model and its impact on student learning that you have seen?
So TIP stands for Thematic Interdisciplinary Project-Based Learning. This is something that was developed by a woman named Diana Velasquez in Los Angeles, who was a teacher, then a principal, and now is the director of the juvenile court schools. So they don't do community schools, but it's all the lockup facilities in Los Angeles. LA was experiencing a lot of troubles and needed a new model because what they were doing was not working. Diana developed this as one of many pilots. This one just happened to be very successful and was scaled up. A theme in thematic interdisciplinary project-based learning is something that community members, including teachers, are supposed to talk about. What is it that our students need inside of them to be successful? And so in LA, they came up with themes like hope and new beginnings. Out here, the theme that seems to be most popular is like perseverance. There are a number of other themes, but it's just the idea that this is something that young people need inside them to be successful. Teachers then collaborate to design curriculum around a theme. So if you're a history teacher, you're thinking about, and the theme is hope, what aspect of US history could I teach? And could we look at through the lens of hope? If you're a science teacher, what aspect of science curriculum could we use and look at it through a lens of hope? then students would demonstrate their learning through a project. So the students aren't just learning about content within a theme, but they're actually doing something with that content and they're presenting a project. They then exhibit it to an audience and share both their products and their process of learning, how we learned this, what we learned, and how this relates to the theme. And quite often in these settings, students are being asked, well, how are you going to need hope in your life? Because it's just a natural question that emerges, and it's something the students are often thinking about. That was the model in LA, and in San Diego, we kind of started there and have adjusted based on what we've found to be successful and what we found has not worked as well. So one of the things that's happened is that a theme is something that's being used, but that T could also stand for a topic. So a topic like the Flint water crisis. So what our teachers were finding is that the more relevant the topic, the more engagement you'll have among the students. And if you can find an interdisciplinary topic rather than just an interdisciplinary theme, that it's going to come alive for these students. An example, maybe we look at the theme of persistence, but we look at the interdisciplinary topic of the Flint water crisis. And there's plenty we think we can do through science, and there's plenty we can do through social science, and there's plenty we can do through ELA always. But that the students would then become experts on the topic and the theme and demonstrate their learning through a project. And one other difference that we have with what LA's done and what we're doing is that we do spend a lot more time emphasizing the quality of the product. So we just had an exhibition where students made a documentary about the juvenile justice, about their experiences within the juvenile justice system. And that's a site where kids are coming and going every 2 weeks. But they made like a 40-minute documentary because the story was such that new kids could come in and just find their place in it, see what the other students had done, figure out their story, and go out and film it. So that is born out of emphasizing the product. If you didn't emphasize the product, you would be satisfied with students maybe doing a 2-3 minute iVideo that maybe your first or second draft and then go present that. But we have kind of constantly emphasized putting out a high quality final product because we found that our students learn to persevere through refinement and getting critique and going back and having to get it done better. We have a lot of students who've been conditioned to, like, schoolwork is something that you do to turn in to get a grade. And oftentimes students will say, this is what I do and I turned it in and I either get an A or an F. And you're like, well, what do you mean an A or an F? And they'll say, well, if I did it correctly, I get an A, and if I didn't, I get an F, and that's just kind of the way it is. And so we're trying to get students to understand that in real life, you need to kind of consistently work to do a better job and a better job and a better job and take pride in your work, and that your final product should be indicative of a whole lot of work and refinement.
Can you talk? Can you talk about how the TIP has impacted the culture of JCCS for various stakeholders? So talked a little bit about students, but more, family members, administrators, the teachers who are working with the students in the classroom. If you can say a little bit about that.
So I think the biggest, TIP has had an impact on a lot of people. One that really jumps to mind is probation. Probation keeps coming to these exhibitions and being blown away. And probation, they're a very authentic group of people. And so they will flat out say that this is the greatest thing that they've ever seen in education. A lot of them have worked in our system for 20, 30 years. And they'll talk about how they've never seen anything like this, but that this is exactly the type of thing that the students need. They are moved by exhibition. I mean, probation officers are often punishing our students, but they care deeply about our students. And to see our students doing something that fills them with pride and our students doing something that is impressive and honest has an emotional impact on our probation officers. Our probation officers also will talk usually, especially if it's their first exhibition at the site, about how when this first started, they didn't think it was going to work, and they were kind of bothered by how much just things had changed, right? It wasn't students sort of sitting quietly behind an individual work packet. It was students often getting up and racing to a location to get something that they needed for their project, or pulling a group aside so that they could quickly rehearse something. And probation is really hyper conscious of movement, so those things weren't things that they took kindly to. But they will also say, and this is going to become a pattern, they'll say that by the second week, we just started to notice so much purpose in the students' movements that we decided to ease back on our rules. And then by the third week, we started noticing that the students everything they were doing was so focused, and they were so into their learning and their work, that we just decided we'll go with it. And then by the time they get to exhibition, they're blown away and they want more of it. That said, old habits die hard, and so that's always a tension. And are we going to get a new probation officer who doesn't really understand the work and may try to shut it down? Or are probation ideally really supportive of the work? And so in an ideal setting, probation would be in on helping to select the themes, so they would have their voice on those themes, and then they're really like a collaborative partner. And that's something that we're definitely trying to work on, but we're dealing with decades of not a tremendous amount of collaboration between the education side and the residential side, if you will. Our teachers have been impacted substantially. So, we just had a teacher win Teacher of the Year for the juvenile court schools up and down the state of California. It's never happened before. Our district's never had a Teacher of the Year. And she's a superstar, but she talks constantly about how much she's grown this year by taking it all in and trying on new things, and really being mindful of are all of her students learning, and are all of her students contributing, and what else can she do. But every teacher, we've had people who are totally independent of the pilot come in from San Diego County Office of Education, Learning and Leadership Services, who do learning walks at our sites to sort of assess where we are in terms of student learning and implementation of different district objectives. These are folks who walk classrooms a couple times a year. And they'll straight up say that they have never seen anything like this in terms of teachers who they never imagined engaging in high quality instruction, now doing teaching moves that they literally just can't even comprehend that it's happening by the same person who they went in their classroom the last 2-3 years and saw that instruction, to now see what they're trying to do in terms of pushing students' thinking and asking questions to deepen students' thinking, and getting students to try to prove a theory, and things like this. And the teachers have in our pilot have a pretty high morale. They're actually enjoying the work this year, and that isn't necessarily always the case in our district. In terms of students, we have students who are constantly rotating through sites, and if a student sees me at a site that's not doing TIP, they will walk in front of other principals. I had students walk into, I was doing a leadership academy, facilitating professional learning for our principals, for our district directors, and a student walked in to pull me aside to say, hey, you may have remembered me from Reflections, or you may have remembered me from GRF. They're not doing TIP at this site. Can you go talk to these teachers?
That's awesome.
And so the students are now starting to advocate, one, but then also I'm finding students who are, who I'll see at sites who are doing it, who are like, this is just like the learning we were getting at the True Unit, and did you help make these connections because they're doing this here? Or students who are about to transfer and want to know whether their next site is going to be doing TIP or not doing TIP, because they're hopeful that they can continue their project, or they're hopeful that they can work at another project. Or students who are transferred into a site and that has high turnover, and when their teacher explains what the project's going to be and what the exhibition is going to be, those students will say, oh my gosh, I was just doing this at such and such site, and you all don't be nervous, you'll be able to do these exhibitions and it's a lot of fun. And so that's been wild, and that's been powerful, and those are the types of things when I hear that, where I'm like, it can't just be 1 or 2 sites doing this well. We need every site to be doing this well. It's had an impact on school culture. So there are sites that have had major culture issues, and I talk about culture issues like serious violence, routine, like shut down the place, make arrests, send the kids to the court, to the halls, who are now like a school, who are now like can all sit in a circle and engage in a discussion about something that they've read, who can get serious about their learning, who can actually look forward to exhibitions. So I feel like it's been successful wherever it is, and that's being said, we still have, and this gets to that question of what next, we have room to grow, I'm a big believer that one, if teachers are gonna grow, they have to buy into something. So if we wanna do project-based learning, or we wanna do TIP, or we wanna do this new thing, and therefore we know that we have to make some shifts. That's a big key to moving practice, to elevating teaching and learning. Once you're making the shifts, are you giving them a sense of the whole game? So like these are all the things that we eventually want to see in a learning environment. But we're gonna meet you where you are. So you're gonna go and try something on in a safe space. We're gonna see how that goes, and we're gonna think about what are we already doing well, what can we do, and what's like the next natural step. So it's like overwhelming at first to think, oh my God, this is what we're trying to do, but now let's work on this piece. And now we've got that down, and now let's bring in the next piece and the next piece. So you're never like operating in the dark, but you're also not operating in a place where you feel like you're failing because there's too much to take on. And so it really depends upon each site what their next move is, but I will say one of the things that we're starting to work on across the district is a kind of equity issue of you could call it like simultaneous engagement. So we've been working on trying to deepen the level of thinking and understanding, but who's doing, is that everybody, or is that only a few students? Like what teaching structures do we need in place to make sure that everybody is engaged, everybody's understanding, everybody's learning, everybody's deepening their thinking? How do we get students to take a stance where they're kind of constantly pushing each other's thinking?
Given that, and given the impact that this has had on school culture, relationships amongst teachers and students, do you think that this type of learning model could be a preventative model for public schools before students reach a point of alternative ed or incarceration?
I do. I think that gets back to the relevance piece. So I don't know that TIP alone, as this becomes a thing, I think there's going to be multiple models of TIP, just like there's PBL, but that looks different in different spaces. So yes, school is more engaging when you get to work on projects. School is more relevant when you're thinking about themes that involve you and what you need to do to be successful. School is more engaging when you have that interdisciplinary piece, so that you're easily able to make connections between your science class and your history class, and in an ideal world, your math class and your English class. We talk about our students have a trauma fog. Our students are brimming with trauma, all of them. So I always, when we launched the work, we talked about imagine yourself at your most distracted inside of a classroom, and how much were you learning? Mm-hmm. And so if you're not revisiting the same theme over and over again, or the same interdisciplinary topic, you have nothing to really connect the learning to. But if you are going back and you are revisiting it, whether you're learning a language or whether you have a lot of trauma or whether it's both, you have something to attach your learning to, and that's really important. Those things will all help. But I think in terms of preventative, the missing component is it real? You can learn those themes in a way that is just not real. Or you can deal with the real stuff that our students are dealing with. Can you really apply this theme of perseverance to like real life? Do the students have a safe space to share what they're truly going through and to apply their theme to what they're truly going through? And if a student starts giving answers like, well, I'm gonna beat drugs and then I'm gonna become a Navy SEAL. Well, are we real about that? About what it actually takes to become a Navy SEAL? are we real about what it actually takes to beat a drug addiction? And so that's where, like, I think dealing with real topics and even real problems, and doing all of this in an authentic way is vital. Do our kids, I always ask my teachers, like, can your students be who they are in this space? Or have you created a condition where they have to basically pretend to be who you want them to be so they can get a credit and get a grade? And so these things, I think, go deeper than a framework. But if you're not doing project-based learning, then how are you engaging kids who typically disengage from school? And if you're not doing something thematic, then what are you doing on a socio-emotional level to make the student understand that all of this learning can be applied to yourself? And if you're not doing interdisciplinary teaching, whether that's thematic or it's by topic or whatever, then what are you doing to make sure that your students leave here with anything, given that most of your students are coming in here and they're going to be distracted and perhaps overwhelmed by their own trauma, that it's going to take a lot for what you're teaching to actually penetrate.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it and enjoyed our visit out to your schools.
Thank you. I hope you come again, see if we're progressing and what our next steps are.
Awesome.
Thank you.